The Haunted Apartment. In 2013, Sarah, a young woman in her mid-20s, moved into a new apartment in a quiet part of the city. She had just started her first full-time job and was eager to settle into her new life. The apartment was old but affordable, with creaky floors and a musty smell that she didn't mind at first. It was a top-floor unit, and the view of the city skyline was beautiful, especially at night. Sarah loved her new space despite its age. However, strange things started happening almost immediately. The first incident occurred on the second night. Sarah had just gotten into bed, ready to get some rest after a long day of work. As she lay there in the dark, she suddenly heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slowly, methodically, they echoed down the hallway outside her bedroom door. They were slow and heavy, and they didn't sound like the footsteps of someone rushing home. It was as if someone was walking back and forth, pacing. At first, Sarah thought it was her neighbor, perhaps late-night noise, but the building was quiet, and she hadn't heard anyone come in. She figured it would stop eventually, but it didn't. The pacing continued back and forth, around the same time every night. When she couldn't take it anymore, Sarah decided to investigate. She opened the door to the hallway, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, no lights were on, and no doors were open. She was unnerved but tried to brush it off as an overactive imagination, or perhaps an old building settling. But the footsteps didn't stop. They continued each night, getting louder. One evening, after several days of disturbed sleep, Sarah finally got up and checked the building's history, hoping to understand the odd occurrences. What she found left her feeling ice cold. The apartment complex had been built over a century ago, and before it became residential housing, it had been a boarding house for troubled men. Most disturbing of all was the fact that one of those men had been found dead in her apartment, a suicide that had been ruled an overdose. The man's name was Andrew, and according to the building's records, he had struggled with severe depression and had been found alone in his room, hours after his death. The more Sarah learned, the more uneasy she became. The pacing she heard each night sounded eerily similar to the steps of someone trapped in their own mind, walking endlessly through the darkness, unable to escape. Then, things got worse. One evening, Sarah came home late from work to find her apartment in disarray. Drawers were open, papers were scattered across the floor, and the furniture had been moved. She was certain she had locked everything before leaving, but now, it looked as though someone had been inside. She immediately called the police, thinking she had been robbed, but nothing was missing. The police couldn't find any signs of forced entry. It was as though the apartment had been ransacked by an invisible force. Sarah was terrified and slept at a friend's house for the next few nights, but when she returned, the apartment was exactly as it had been when she left, the disarray unchanged. But it didn't end there. One morning, Sarah was in the shower when she felt a presence in the room. She froze, feeling the unmistakable sensation of someone watching her. The water grew cold suddenly, and she heard a faint whispering voice coming from behind her. "Leave!" Terrified, Sarah jumped out of the shower and rushed out of the bathroom. Trembling, she checked the apartment, but again, there was no one there. That whisper, the chilling warning, lingered in her mind. She had no choice but to leave. As Sarah moved out, she was approached by the building's landlord, who had been informed of her decision to vacate. He offered no sympathy or understanding of her fears, but simply said, "It's not the first time this has happened." He went on to explain that other tenants had reported strange events, but most had left without asking questions. The building, it seemed, was cursed. Sarah left the apartment behind, never looking back. To this day, she wonders what happened in that old building, who or what was walking those endless steps at night, and what it wanted. She never heard the footsteps again, but sometimes when she lies in bed, she can still hear that whisper, as if it's following her wherever she goes. as Sarah settled into a new apartment, far from the haunted place she had fled. She thought she could finally put the experience behind her, but the unsettling feeling never quite left her. Every time she passed an old, abandoned building, her heart would race. Every creak in her new place, every odd sound would send a chill down her spine. She had been through a terrifying ordeal, but she had survived, or so she thought. Months later, Sarah received a call from a former neighbor from the old building. Her name was Lisa, and she had lived in the apartment next door to Sarah's. She sounded frantic, her voice shaking. "Sarah, I've been hearing things," Lisa whispered. "I think it's back. I think it's still here." At first, Sarah was confused. "What do you mean? What's still there?" "It's the apartment," Lisa said, her voice trembling. "The one you moved out of. I can hear it. Those footsteps. And something else. Something worse." Sarah's blood ran cold. She thought the nightmare was over, that it had stayed behind with the building, but now it seemed to have followed her. Lisa went on to explain that she had been hearing the same pacing noises Sarah had once heard in the hallway, only now they were louder, and they seemed to be coming from inside her own apartment. Lisa described waking up in the middle of the night, feeling a cold presence in the room, and hearing whispers that echoed in her ears. The voice was the same one Sarah had heard in the shower. "Leave." Unable to sleep or live in peace, Lisa told Sarah she had decided to leave the building, just as Sarah had. But something was different this time. Lisa felt as though the entity was following her too. She had visited the old apartment, trying to confront the source of the strange occurrences. But when she entered, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Her apartment seemed to change. Things weren't where they were supposed to be, and a bitter cold filled the space. Even after she left, the feeling of being watched lingered, suffocating. Then came the final straw. A few days later, Lisa called Sarah crying. "It followed me," Lisa said, her voice broken. "I tried to leave, but it's everywhere I go. In the dark. I can feel it. It won't stop. It's inside me." Lisa's voice cracked one last time before the line went dead. Sarah immediately called her back, but there was no answer. The next day, Lisa's body was found. She had been discovered in her apartment, lying motionless on the floor, her eyes wide open and frozen in fear. Her phone, still clutched in her hand, showed the last text she had sent. "It's here. It's in my head." The police found no signs of foul play, no clear cause of death. The investigation went nowhere, but Sarah knew deep down, from her own experience, that the building's curse hadn't been lifted. Whatever entity haunted that place had claimed another soul. With her mind reeling, Sarah couldn't shake the fear that it was only a matter of time before it came for her too. Her life began to spiral as she struggled with sleepless nights, the eerie whispers that seemed to reach her from the shadows, and the sense of being constantly followed. The footsteps grew louder in her mind, the cold presence always lurking just beyond the corner of her vision. Desperate to end the terror, Sarah sought help from paranormal investigators, but even they couldn't explain the malevolent force that had consumed the building or the people who had lived there. No amount of cleansing rituals, salt circles, or protection prayers seemed to have any effect. It was as if the entity had grown stronger with each passing victim, feeding off their fear and torment. Sarah moved again, this time to a different city entirely, hoping for peace. But despite the change of location, the nightmare still followed her. Her dreams were haunted by shadowy figures and endless footsteps pacing through dark hallways. Every creak of the floor, every cold gust of wind sent her heart racing. And now, years later, Sarah is convinced that she'll never truly escape. The building that once held her captive still exists, standing silent and foreboding at the edge of the city. But it's not the walls that are haunted. It's the curse that lies within them. And Sarah knows it won't stop until it's claimed everyone it's set its sights on. She often wonders if Lisa's death was the last, or if the next victim is still out there, waiting for the curse to find them. Every night, when the darkness settles, Sarah hears those footsteps again. This time, they're not just in her mind. They're coming for her. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before the entity found her. Despite her best efforts to outrun the haunting, it was always there, just beyond the threshold of her awareness. The dreams continued, vivid and terrifying, the cold, oppressive darkness of the hallway, the whispering voices, the pacing of those slow, deliberate footsteps. It felt as though it was only a matter of time before it reached out from the shadows and claimed her, just as it had Lisa. One night, after another sleepless evening filled with unsettling dreams, Sarah decided to confront her fear. She packed her bag with salt, holy water, candles, and every bit of protection she could find, desperate to find closure. It wasn't logical, but she felt like she had to return to that building, the source of all the terror. She needed answers, or at least to understand what was happening to her. As she stood before the abandoned structure, her heart pounded in her chest. It looked even worse than she remembered, its windows dark and hollow like eyes staring back at her. The old building was decaying, crumbling from years of neglect. Yet it felt alive in a way that made her skin crawl. Taking a deep breath, Sarah stepped inside, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The smell of mold and decay assaulted her senses, but she pressed on. The darkness seemed thicker here, more oppressive, like it wanted to swallow her whole. She made her way up the stairs, each creak of the wood beneath her feet making her jump. As she reached the hallway that had once been hers, she felt a sudden, intense cold. Her breath fogged in the air. The walls, once covered in peeling wallpaper, now looked even more twisted, as though they were warping before her eyes. Then she heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and measured, walking toward her from the end of the hallway. Her blood ran cold. There was no one else in the building, yet she could hear the footsteps growing closer. Her heart raced as she turned to face the source of the sound, but no one was there. The footsteps stopped. The air grew thick with tension, and the oppressive cold sank deeper into her bones. The whispers started, soft at first, but growing louder, more insistent. "Leave." The voice was chillingly familiar. It was the same voice Sarah had heard so many times before, the one that had once whispered to her in the shower. It wasn't just in her mind this time. It was real, and it was calling her to leave, just like it had called Lisa. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached into her bag and pulled out a vial of holy water. She sprinkled it in the air, chanting prayers under her breath. But the whispers didn't stop. They only grew louder, more desperate, and then she saw it. From the corner of her vision, a shadow began to move. It slithered across the floor, growing larger, darker, more twisted. It was as if the very darkness of the room was alive and had taken shape, forming a monstrous, inhuman figure. Its eyes, hollow and black, locked onto hers, and she froze. "Leave," the voice hissed again. But this time, it wasn't just a whisper. It was a guttural growl, as if the entity were warning her to get out before it was too late. The temperature dropped even further. Sarah's breath came in sharp gasps, her chest tightening as if the very air around her had turned to stone. She tried to move, but her legs felt paralyzed. The shadow in front of her began to writhe, taking on a more distinct form, its limbs stretching unnaturally, like something out of a nightmare. Its shape wasn't human. It was a grotesque, contorted thing, with eyes that seemed to pierce through her very soul. Desperation hit her. She knew she had to get out of the building, but her feet wouldn't move. The entity was right there, just inches away, and it was drawing closer. In a final, frantic attempt to escape, Sarah managed to take a step back, her foot finding the edge of a loose floorboard. She stumbled but regained her balance, rushing toward the stairs. The footsteps behind her were louder now, heavier, as if something, or someone, was chasing her. The whispers were deafening, surrounding her, pulling at her thoughts. By the time Sarah reached the door, the building felt alive, its walls closing in around her. She forced the door open and burst into the night air, gasping for breath. The moon hung